Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our South Asian Studies lecture series. I'm Leila Fernandez. In case I haven't met you, I'm the new director of the Center for South Asian Studies. So I'm really delighted today to introduce our speaker, Subir Sinha, who teaches in the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, also known as SOAS in London. He's trained as a political scientist, and he's, in my view, one of the best models of political scientists who kind of strains and contorts and revolutionizes the discipline. He works at the cross-section of a number of fields, including the study of institutional change, sustainable development, social movements, state-society relations and development, and South Asian politics. He's published more than a dozen articles and essays on subjects ranging from environmentalism to agrarian development, post-colonial theory, sustainable development, and social media, elections, and populism. Some of his recent articles on these subjects include a 2018 article called Fragile Hegemony, Modi, Social Media, and Competitive Electoral Populism in India, a really timely subject. His 2016 article is called Histories of Power and Universalization of Capital in India, Between and Beyond Marxism and Postcolonial Theory. It's an incredibly rich range of writings. We're delighted to have him here today because we tried to get him last year and the polar vortex kind of kidnapped him, so we couldn't get him, so we're glad that he made it. His current focus is on decentralized development in India, early post-colonial planning, and on the global fisher workers movement. And the title of his talk today is Off Commodities and Frontiers, Looking for Capitalism on the Edges of Britain's Indian Colonies. Please welcome Professor Sinha.
Thanks so much, Leela, and thanks so much also to Clement and to William Farina, who had organized this earlier during the polar vortex moment. Thanks to the governor of Michigan for having given advance warning so that actually I did not land up here in the middle of that polar vortex. Slight change in the title, but not in the content. It's now called The Prawn That Flew to the Waldorf Astoria because much hangs on that particular prawn and its flight to the Waldorf Astoria. Basically, if you were someone who kind of hung around in the circles of the militant Kerala fish workers movement in the 1970s, 80s, or in my case in the 1990s and later, sooner or later a particular story would emerge, which was that the collapse of the prawn fisheries in Kerala happened completely by accident. That there was a person from Kerala who was an assistant chef at the Waldorf Astoria, and he always made a comment about the fact that the size of the prawns that he found being served at extremely high price at the Waldorf Astoria was way smaller than the prawns that were available in Kerala. And on one particular trip, he is rumored to have, and this is an apocryphal story as far as I can imagine, I can't imagine prawns being flown around in people's hand baggage in the way in which the story says it did, but that a prawn is flown there and it is basically of 700 grams, okay? Now, whether or not that particular story is correct, and as it turns out, I have in my freezer right now prawns which are about 200 grams, but it starts off a particular kind of a prawn export boom, which starts off in the late 1960s, and then within about 10 years, a prawn bust happens. The size of the prawn that is available in the market is way smaller, indicating that they are not allowed to reach maturity. And it is because of the specifics of what is called capture fisheries, destructive trawling, affecting habitats and the breeding of many other species. So the collapse of the prawn fisheries, because of the intensive nature of the capture fishery, also results in the collapse of a whole range of other varieties, and that results in a major bust, not just for prawn, but for many other seafood varieties. Very soon after that, by the early 1980s, you have prawn capture fishing moving along the Indian coast, replicating exactly the same process. A fast boom resulting in a massive bust of prawn and of many other seafood varieties. And then within the 90s, you begin to see something like a shift from capture to culture fisheries, which basically pushes ecological catastrophe inland because people are no longer now interested in prawn that is found in the ocean. They begin to farm it, and that is why it is called culture fisheries. In turn, that results in a whole range of destruction of habitat and agricultural land via prawn and shrimp aquaculture. Now, this sort of story of short boom and long busts, which basically forces capital to seek new fishing grounds, is very familiar, and it resonates with several recent attempts to write global histories of capitalism particularly. Some of you might be familiar with Jason Moore's Capitalism and the Web of Life, in which this particular dynamic is very central to both those two things. He will, in terms of the universalization of capitalism, as well as on the, as far as the ecological catastrophe attending to and accompanying the universalization of capitalism is concerned. Far less concerned with ecological questions, you have Sven Beckert's work on the global history of cotton. And then again, he seems to be thinking in terms of the fact that the commodity form and the commodity frontier opened by warfare or conquest is the sort of point zero through which a process is unfolding which results in the universalization of the commodity form and through the commodity form of capitalism itself. So Philip McMichael, food regimes kind of literature, again for several years has been looking at that and systematically. And this is not necessarily new, despite the fact that many people within the commodity frontiers literature make a claim to newness. We could go to Sidney Mintz's study of sugar much earlier on, and also similar studies on tobacco and so on and so forth. So the idea that the so-called global countryside is very much a part and parcel of and constitutive of the unfolding of the universal logic of capital is something, while claims of its newness are made, empirical evidence and previous studies on the topic are numerous. What they seem to be thinking is that at some point, something within rural nature gets converted into commodities. And it is that particular problem that is the main theme of what I want to talk about. So in the commodity frontiers literature, it is very important to privilege colonial conquest as the kind of a starting process. And it is because of this that they kind of make an argument that if you think in terms of the classical literature on the transition to capitalism within original sites of that transition in Western Europe, the idea was that something analogous to what people refer to as primitive accumulation is taking place, but this is not taking place in the same way. It is taking place not via enclosures, not via a 200 or 300 year drawn out period, but it's taking place really through particular events of colonial conquest. And what these events do is that they make available what they refer to as free gifts of land, labor, and nature. So the entire sort of argument rests on the fact that there are people who are funding these colonial adventures, conquest. For example, in the case of Jason Moore, he talks about the conquest of the island of Madeira through a process which is funded by bankers in small Italian city-states. And the logic of it is that since they've paid money behind this conquest, what they would like is quick returns to that capital. That in itself, the desire for there to be quick return on capital, basically suggests that they are pushing for intensive and extensive production of commodities. So in order for this argument to work, what we need to think of is whether or not the universalization of the commodity form works in similar ways for all commodities, or is it actually only some aspects of rural nature that get transformed into commodities? So for example, for cotton, we hear that this process, according to Beckert, is in the 17th century. For sugar, In the case of Jason Moore's writing on Madeira, it is much earlier, in the 16th century. Now, there's a time lag between the prawn that flies off into the Waldorf Astoria and the moment of colonial conquest of the regions from which this prawn originated its flight, which is, in my case, the northern part of the southern state of Kerala. So what I want to do is to explore this time lag between the moment of conquest and of colonization and the commodity production or the transformation of sea fish, but particularly prawn, into commodities. And in my view, it is exploring this time lag between the moment of colonization and the transformation of marine fish into commodities that opens up a number of possibilities for thinking about both a kind of post-colonial political economy, but also to think in terms of a post-colonial political ecology. It seems to me that both of them are missing in the accounts of global capitalism, such as the ones that Moore and Beckett are talking about. So before we think in terms of how this critique might proceed, it is, I think, no secret that perhaps the most systematic meditation on the commodity and its relationship with capitalism is to be found in the writings of Marx, and particularly in Capital Volume 1, the starting chapters. And in fact, in those chapters is made the necessary link between capitalism and the commodity form. So, not surprisingly, many of the people who make these kinds of arguments may or may not be Marxists in some kind of card-carrying sort of way, but certainly they rely on that literature to some extent on making the arguments regarding how this relationship actually might work. One key element of that argumentation is that it provides a link between the so-called incorporation into the world economy of peripheral areas. So, for example, if you look at the work of Wilma Dunaway, who works on Appalachian forests, she does not use the word commodity frontiers. She thinks of frontiers as zones of incorporation, does not necessarily link it with capitalism per se. Okay? So what commodity frontiers approaches do is that they make a set of linkages in a very highly stylized and systemized way. And the linkages they make are between incorporation into the world economy via colonial conquest, forced extraction of certain kinds of goods, primitive accumulation, moving on from there into trade, because that is very key in terms of giving value to the things that are being stolen or that are being extracted. That trade itself seems to stimulate, because more people want to get in on that, commodity production, and this somehow will lead on to what they refer to as mature capitalism or mature accumulation, i.e. not accumulation of the primitive variety in which force, warfare, theft, etc. are absolutely critical, but of a mature variety in the sense that all of those processes have now receded into the past, or they have become systematized via law, for example, of private property, and via regulatory frameworks, for example, for trade and things like that. Now, my suggestion is that prawn and fish, and perhaps many other commodities, timber, for example, in another part of my work on the Postcolonial Commons, they defy this kind of highly schematic and stagist narrative of how you move from forced extraction in the first instance via all of those stages to so-called mature capitalism. And so what is it that is marking these interruptions or discontinuities in that particular schematic narrative is part of what I want to talk about. So, a commodity is many things. And it requires many things. It's not just something that is traded. It is not just something which somehow moves from use value to exchange value. For example, if I was using something personally and I sold it to you, that in itself does not make it into a commodity. In order for something to become a commodity, from use to exchange, that transition must be extensive and expansive. In other words, many people produce it, and many people buy it. That also means that there must be some kind of a market demand for a particular commodity. For many things, we initially did not really have a particular demand. That demand gets stimulated through a whole range of practices, including, for example, marketing, and later on we shall see attempts at the failed attempts at creating a particular demand for seafood within India and from South Kerala. There's a particular emphasis on the legal side of things. There must be laws that protect and secure private property rights to the commodity. That must make it legal for us to be able to trade it, and these rights must be transferable from one owner to another. So, for example, I could be a catcher of prawn and I sell it to you as an aggregator of many people's catch. You can then in turn sell it to a processor for whatever other purposes. So each of these different steps that come into play requires a transfer of private property rights from one particular agent in this entire chain to another. And that also includes, obviously, the fact that the commodity itself must be physically transferable. So by physically transferable, if you can think in terms of seafood, that again requires a whole range of things to happen. Someone has to store it. Someone has to package it. Perhaps this requires freezing or salting. Someone has to be able to transfer it from one person to another and finally on to the consumer. In addition, this right must be exclusive. In other words, as for all private property rights, it basically is a right that the owner of that or the holder of that private property has. He or she may want to share it, but is under no compulsion to do so. As this commodity becomes more quote-unquote developed, other things come into the picture. For example, standardization agencies. For most things we buy, there will be some agency, most likely a government agency, that will put a standardization mark on that some government lab or body has examined it and has declared it to be fit for human consumption. As the commodity develops further and as it moves towards the zone of so-called mature production and accumulation, it must be predictable. In other words, if someone has put X amount of money in the production of this particular commodity, they should expect a certain amount of return to that investment based upon their calculations. So in other words, there should be an element of predictability and the elimination of risk in that particular process. Now, only the most developed of commodity forms will have all of these attributes. I want to say later on that seafood, agricultural products, etc., are by this definition not entirely fully developed commodities. Okay? But the point I'm going to be making, and that's to anticipate the kind of post-colonial critique of the commodity frontiers approach, is that a lot of the unpredictability comes from what I call the insistent heterogeneity of the social, but also on the political responses of agents who are part and parcel, whose quiescence or complicity is required in the development of the commodity into its fullest form. So my feeling is, in fact my argument is, that in the agricultural sector, which are nature dependent, when the process of the formation of the commodity is politically contested, it is difficult for that commodity to achieve its full development. So, you know, I had posed a couple of dummy questions in the beginning. Why did it take a time lag of nearly 500 years between colonization and the emergence of Indian marine fish and seafood to emerge as a commodity? What does the quick boom, long bust, and the associated ecological collapses say about the very nature of the commodity? To what extent can this be the basis for a post-colonial reconstruction of the history of the commodity, and what would be its relevance for a political and political ecological post-colonial understanding to the limits of growth of that commodity into its fullest form? Now, you might imagine that for things that did not become commodities, the archive does not have to say very much. It's just the case that things which have no value for traders or for the state are not things that you will find mentioned too much in the archives. So for example, what you don't find, and you find nothing about prawns at all, or fish in general, in by far the most prolific writer of Portuguese colonization of India, Sanjay Subramaniam. There's a lot about many other things, but there's nothing about fish whatsoever. So what do we have is effectively a collection of translations of various documents. In fact, the Portuguese in Kerala, by and large, is missing from the well-known accounts of Portuguese in South Asia. So basically, K.M. Panikkar, a historian of the early part of the 20th century, is the one source where you find I don't know medieval Portuguese, and that is not my field, and I cannot pretend that I've read these documents or gone to the Portuguese archives. So I'm looking into second-hand sources of people who have made these translations. And Panikkar in 1926 basically writes a book called The Portuguese in Malabar, and he makes a number of startling claims which I think suggest to us that many other things were becoming commodities along that particular trajectory from non-commodity to a full commodity, even as early as the colonization of Kerala by the Portuguese, which starts off in 1496, so a long time ago. And what he says is that the Portuguese create a world market for Malabar's produce. Trade, which before this time, he says, was in the hands of a few big merchants, becomes a business of the people at large. So he's basically suggesting that there is a kind of a popular rootedness in the trade practices which have been made possible by Portuguese conquest. So he basically says the Moors traded in what was produced. The Portuguese put pressure on chiefs and rajas to encourage increases in production for trade. So in other words, some kind of an accumulation process is going on. Certain crops like coconut become commercial. So far they were only grown for use, especially coir for ships. The Portuguese introduced better varieties from Africa. That's a very fascinating story in its own right, because they feel that the husk of coconut makes ropes which are much more friendly in terms, they have longevity as ropes to be used for ships. But what they find is that Kerala's coconuts are very small compared to the East African coconuts that they see on the way to Kerala. And Panikkar goes on to say that within 50 to 60 years of Portuguese presence within Kerala, there is a large-scale replacement of the native variety of coconuts by Eastern African varieties of coconuts, because for the same effort you get more husk, and if you get more husk you can make more rope. So the logic of accumulation is driving the replacement of particular plant varieties. So you basically have little or no mention except three very mysterious mentions about fishing people and fish in the documents that Panikkar is translating. One, he says from a document of 1510, fishers are the most docile of the native population. And as soon as they were told about Jesus Christ, the Savior, they readily accepted him. Okay? So they have large-scale, apparently involuntary conversions to Catholicism, and of course, large numbers of Kerala fishers, especially in southern Kerala, continue to be Christians. But here's a very interesting letter from 1516. Okay? Here's someone called Gaspar Gonçalves, and he's writing to the King of Portugal, and this suggests to us the structure of what kind of colonial presence there was of the Portuguese. So here's a man called Gaspar Gonçalves. He's writing to the King of Portugal. He's complaining about another man called Lopo Soares, who was the governor of Cochin in the 1910s, and he's saying that he was tyrannical and rapacious, so much so that no one will obey us, and even the most obedient people in India, who are the fishing people, want to oust us. Now they attack us, kill us, and rob us. So a few years ago, they are the most docile people, and they just accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Master, and now they are robbing, raping, and pillaging the same people. And this, they say, is because of your esteemed and loved fidalgo of the household, like a major retainer, Antonio Real of Cochin, who is, it is said, is in league with the robbers. Okay? Now, if you read Panikkar, what he's describing is a very interesting kind of a situation where people have been given contracts from Lisbon to have some kind of control over small bits of the territory in Kerala, from which they are expected to send back wealth while retaining some portion for themselves. What he's basically describing in these pages is a very rapid changing of hands of territories between different Portuguese officials, between Portuguese officials and local kings who are also fighting for the same territory. And if you wanted to kind of think of it that way, it basically suggests a very short-termist rationale for the rapid exploitation of whatever there is without thinking in terms of a long-term economic strategy for capital accumulation. You don't know how many years you're going to be there. What is also interesting is that it makes one doesn't really know how much one can believe what Gaspar Gonçalves is saying here. Is he actually reporting something which is really happening? Is he saying that so that the King of Portugal decides to then remove Lopes Soares and Antonio Real from the positions that they have been given, and perhaps Gaspar Gonçalves becomes one of these people who has greater control over a greater piece of land? So what the archives are saying is very fragmentary, but at the same time, why the archive is saying what it is seems to be suggesting a logic that does not encourage us to accept it as truth. So an archive whose truth value is in question because of the motives of those people who are producing these documents. Now, all commerce seems very chaotic at this point in time. Portuguese buccaneers, local states and their functionaries, Moorish traders and notables, various chancers of all manners, they jostle with each other for temporary advantage. And they are rapacious precisely because of the expectation of merely temporary advantage. They don't know, as I said, how many years they're going to be. I mean, some of the cases that Panikkar is describing is of absolute, you go into a temple, kill everyone, steal the gold, take it away. This is not obviously commodity production. Now, another mysterious element, a document from 1547, it basically refers to a raid by some Portuguese on a warehouse where it says they confiscated a large amount of dried fish. Okay, now so far we know that the fishing is done by small fishing people. So what we don't know is who dried it, but the fact that it was dried seems to indicate storage and transportation possibilities, one of the key elements of becoming commodity, as we saw in the earlier slide. And a conversion from use to exchange value, and therefore a kind of a rudimentary commodity form. There's yet another one in which a warehouse is described as having been burnt, and if you look at the inventory of that warehouse, among many other things, one of the items listed is a fairly large amount of salted fish. So to salt fish in a place where fish is fresh and abundant, and perhaps there would have been no market for salt fish, right away indicates that that is some amount of export that is going on. And the most we can do is to go back to the original quotation where he says a lot of local people, not only the very big people, get involved in the kind of trade. So there is trade that we can estimate from this. How much? We don't know. Who is the producer? We don't know. Where the production is taking place? We don't know. There is no further information that can be found apart from these very kind of fragmentary and fleeting. The Dutch replaced the Portuguese in 1667. Panikkar has another book, The Dutch in Malabar, from 1931, and that is the only one mention of fish that we find in that entire book. Any Dutch official can take all the fish he wants from the market. Okay, so there is no trade. The Dutch are not interested in that. They are interested in other things, such as, for example, spices. And since they don't control too much territory, they seem primarily to be interested in taking spices from Malabar to put and plant in other places that they think are analogous to Malabar. So, for example, Indonesia, they take a lot of southern Indian spices, black pepper, cardamom, cinnamon and things like that, sugarcane, which they take to Suriname. And what we can think about is a kind of a displacement of commodity production from one place in which they have not succeeded in fully colonizing to other places in which they have succeeded into fully colonizing. So the idea that conquest creates some kind of a free gift of land, labor and nature in a straightforward way doesn't seem to work out in these kinds of conquests. What it does seem to suggest, and this is widespread, it seems to me, across colonial history, for example, the British sending spies to the Amazon, to Portuguese territory, to steal rubber, which they then plant in other places like Ghana or Malaysia or India. That kind of a competitive stealing of potentially or already valuable things, or things that have already become commodities, seems to be widespread, and that is what they're doing then. Okay, so the idea of commodity production is there, but in a kind of a displacement from the original locations that have been created and so on. Now, when the British come in, that is when you begin to see systematic movements towards commodity production. They set up something called the Madras Presidency, or the agency, in 1650. The founder of Yale University is the person who is the president of Madras Presidency in 1684, and then this place gets transformed into a presidency in 1785, and Malabar is captured in 1792. So this is the area that I'm really talking about. Okay, this bit of what is now the northern part of the state of Kerala going into the southern part of the state of Karnataka. You can see a nice flag. I didn't realize that they had that kind of a flag. Okay. Right away, they're sort of exporting some very strange things. Shark fins, fish maws, okay, bones and things like that. That's going in for, again, not much indication of where this is going to. There's just a list of things that are being, from 1785 they're exporting. That should be pronounced shunk, basically, the conch which people blow, but that's how they write it, chank fishing, okay? Pearl fishing, they're quite interested in that sort of thing, especially on the east coast of the Madras Presidency between India and what is now Sri Lanka. But within years of the formation of Madras Presidency, and very much different from the Portuguese and the Dutch, you begin to see emergence of what one could now think of as scientific fisheries. So you have an early survey of marine fish on the Indian coastline going all the way to Burma, which, as you remember, was a part of the British colonies. A man called Francis Day produces several volumes in the 1860s. And remember, we had talked about the fact that there are laws being put in place that are making fishing more predictable and so on and so forth. So there's a Fisheries Act of 1897, which is saying things like, can't use dynamite and can't use poisoning for fishing. They create a department of fisheries, and two officials basically called Hornell and Nicholson, who write fascinating stuff like the edible mollusks of the Malabar coast, to which we'll come to in just a minute. They set up a fisheries journal, which is entirely available for you to read on Google. If you just did Madras Fisheries Bulletin, you can read each and every issue of this from 1911 onwards. Okay, and they're basically looking to expand, survey, because the East Coast was already well surveyed, starting off in 1785. What they want to do is to look at the West Coast. Now, during this period, there's a lot of failed experiments from which we can learn a lot in the story of commodity production, but also perhaps in the story of the development of fish as a commodity. So, perhaps you're familiar, but I mean, analogy is a very important element in colonial policy making, and not only colonial policy making. So, for example, when during the American Civil War, cotton supplies to Manchester began to decline, and that resulted in global panic. One thing that they basically began to do was to think of what are places like the American South, which have similar temperatures, similar soil and things like that. And it is around that time that cotton goes into Western India for production, for example. So here, they think of Norway, the leading fisheries power, except of course, it is very much up north. And what they do is, because they tell the local fishing people that your boats are not really good for fishing, we will bring out some Norwegian boats for you people to look at. So they bring out two of these boats called the Lady Nicholson and the Leveret. And they have fishing people standing on the harbor of Cochin. These two boats get in there, but because they were not built keeping in mind the specificities of the Kerala coastline, they can't come back to shore. So what happens is that they actually send the same fishing people who are supposed to be educated by these Norwegian ships out into the ocean to bring the colonial officers and their wives back to shore. They also try other things, canning, but remember, canning requires tin. And tin is not a fully developed commodity in the Indian scenario. Plus, who is going to eat tinned fish in India with so much fish all over the place? They try all kinds of things, and again, this is to stimulate demand. For example, you find references to the fact that the fisheries department holds competitions in schools to design labels for these cans. They start off early fishing freezing yards in 1913 and things like that, so quite early on. But they're not fully aware of what is involved in creating fish, a kind of a fisheries economy. For example, they begin to impose a salt tax that really does not really work out that well, because what that does is that it creates salt monopolists. And the salt monopolists are the people who emerge as the first fishery capitalists on the shorelines of western and eastern parts of Madras Presidency. So in other words, he who controls the salt controls the curing yard, therefore controls the early part of the processing of the fish, and therefore can take advantages for its trade and so on and so forth. And the salt curing yards and its owners basically begin to displace small-scale fishing populations, who then subsequently become objects of state paternalism. So first they get wiped out fairly early in the 20th century, and what you basically begin to see is, and we can come to that later, the sort of colonial state and then the post-colonial state basically begins to invest in making fish productive, and it says that this is primarily for the benefit of very poor fishing people. You can see transnational sciences coming in, marine biological stations coming in, but all of this still results in very limited transitions of the fish. Now, another reason, and that's what I call the insistent heterogeneity of the social, also limits the transition from, the transition of mollusk and shellfish into commodities. And here are, writings by James Hornell on some of these incidents. So he says, in Calicut and Travancore, the mussel consumption was restricted to Mohammedans and Christians, and Hindu castes inferior to the Nayars, though in Malabar, Nayars too will eat them. So there are severe caste restrictions, and as we shall see later, also religious restrictions on who can eat what. For mussels, it basically says, there's a small amount of sale for local consumption and for street hawking. Food of the poor, mussels and shellfish are eaten by the fishermen and by Muslims. Backwater oysters, food of the poor and non-Hindus in Malabar, as better classes of of Hindus do not appreciate oyster. Either the pariah castes eat them, or those upper class Muslims and Christians who emulated the Europeans. Okay? So in other words, there are people who are not by themselves this is not a part of the diet of local people of the upper classes, is the affected upper classes, those who believe that Europeans eat oysters, so it must be good, who have taken some amount of participation in this particular market. Again, there are attempts to create an economy for this. You see that the government basically is interested in leasing out oyster fishing sites, but again there are caste limitations on oyster consumption, partly because the waters in which oyster beds are located were contaminated by sewage. So these are in the drains coming out of the, if you want to call them slums, of these coastal towns, and clams are again part of the diet of the poor fishers. So there's a whole range of people eating these things, but they are either eating them because they are collecting them, or they are eating them as snacks in local bars in seedy parts of town where respectable and therefore moneyed people would not go, or these things are being extracted from rivers, from coastal waters which are considered not very pure. But what is interesting is in all of these surveys of shellfish and mollusk, there is no mention of prawn. Okay? It's about oysters, it's about clams, it's about mussels, but not prawn. It is just not seen as an edible thing at that point in time. Who ate them? What local markets existed? You can see the fine detail of clam markets or mussel markets, but not of prawn markets. I've been looking at old Kerala cookbooks, but Mrs. Varughese cookbook has no mention of this. Mrs. Matthews' cookbook also has no mention of this. Okay? So what can we extrapolate from the surveys? Can we extrapolate something from the fact that there were caste restrictions on other shellfish and mollusks? To what extent could these possibly also extend to prawns? Were there caste restrictions on the consumption of prawn as they were bottom feeders? You know, prawn basically are so-called demersal species. They basically eat the debris of other things. Could it be that upper class Muslims did not eat them because even today there's a big debate in Pakistan and an ongoing one on whether or not prawn is halal or haram? And you can open up, you can see that there is a desire for certain people to rule one way or another, but the status of prawn as an edible thing is not really clear. Could it be that it was, as another food of the poor, that it was so much under the radar that it was beyond or beneath the so-called archive producing gaze, or colonial officers just never came across this as something that was worthy of looking at? One thing that I did find was mention of the fact that prawns were primarily used as manure for growing coconuts. If you wanted to grow coconut trees, you basically prepared the bed by putting some amount of fresh prawns, put your coconut, cover it with prawns, cover up the hole, hope for the best coconut tree to come out of it. So it's not something that has much market value. Okay? Now we come back to the prawn that flew to the Waldorf Astoria. And, you know, what is, let us ask, the precondition for prawn, for the emergence of prawn as a commodity? And my suggestion is, it is the, and this is not a particularly novel suggestion, was the establishment of stable state power that brought Indian fisheries into the ambit of a so-called transnational general intellect. In other words, a particular form of knowledge which is widely shared and is not anyone's private property. Marx has a whole section on what he calls general intellect in one of his writings. By this time, canning technology and the two world wars had created global markets for tropical seafood. Okay? This was not the case in the previous centuries. Remember all those failed experiments. State sets up quality control, again one of the preconditions for there to be a commodity, which basically is setting standards for quality and safety of prawns. There's a setting up of cooperatives and marketing boards. There's a lot of loans and subsidies for craft and gear and fuel, which are also captured by the same kind of proto-capitalists that we saw earlier on as people who had control over the salt trade and therefore over the curing yards. Particularly Japan's post-war recovery creates a massive demand for tropical seafood. Prawns from India, but a lot of tropical fish, for example, from southern Latin America. So much so that there is a collapse of certain fisheries in these parts of the world in the early 1970s. So this basically creates an extensive and widespread move from use to exchange, and this is also aided by the fact that there are advances in refrigerated storage and transportation facilities such that it now becomes possible for prawn to become a physically transferable commodity. But there is a lack of adequate privatization. I mean, by its very nature, you really can't privatize any particular seafood variety. Maybe clams, because they don't move so much. But otherwise, though I've seen recently that they do move. But otherwise, if you look at the classic writing on fishing, the term, for example, from the 1950s, classic article by a man called Gordon, he refers to them as fugitive resources. They move to different parts. If you were to privatize one slice of the ocean, it's not clear that prawn would just stick around in that part of the ocean. So one of the arguments for complete commodity development or development of a complete commodity form was to have secure private property rights. But my argument is that it's not possible for fish. And likewise, the idea of a transferable private property right does not quite work out as well. You can't really have predictability, another criteria for the full development of the commodity form, because there is no full accounting for how much fish there is. You can't do a full fish census, and especially not then. So on what basis is someone going to calculate how much they can extract without tipping things over into a zone of catastrophe? Rapid and massive extraction meant that prawn fishing was very risky, okay? And it basically, that is what necessitates the move from capture fisheries to culture fisheries. But most importantly, there's militant opposition from small fishers to the complete commodification of fish, and they particularly are very much opposed to what they see as de facto privatization of the commons, because much greater capacity vessels come in to extract prawn, which effectively excludes them from a share of the catch. So now let me sort of come towards the concluding parts of what I have to say. There's a strange and I think under-read article by Dipesh Chakravarty, which is called "Can There Be a Post-Colonial Political Economy?", which is in a volume which is called Postcolonial Economics. And he says, no, there can't be one, because according to him, the foundational categories of classical political economy, including Marxism, such as land, labor, capital, they just don't operate in the post-colony. So, I mean, he's insisting on a particular kind of irresolvable alterity of native categories which just cannot make sense within the optics of classical political economy. But I would basically argue that if you look at the long process of the incorporation of people, things, various kinds of biological life, territories including coastal waters into global circuits of trade, but not only of trade, also of scientific and technological knowledges and of governmental practices. Okay? So it seems to me that if you take a view of all of this taking place over a 500-year period, the insistence that somehow native categories cannot be thought of within supposedly Western categories is not a fruitful way to think in terms of the universalization of capital and the resistance to that universalization of capital. In fact, later on I'd argue that the further development of the commodity form that Indian prawn and seafood took was because of a buy-in into the commodity form by small-scale fishers, by exactly the kind of people that this particular critique would argue that they don't have that kind of mindset or that they think differently. And this particularly had to do with the acceptance of the concept of a maximum sustainable yield, a consensus about how much scientifically arrived at or in fact, it can't be scientifically precisely be arrived at. So, what could be a good guess, really? Now, a lot of things that can be said here about the argument regarding the relationship between colonial conquest and the emergence of the free gifts of land, labor, and nature. The control of territory by the Portuguese and the Dutch did not result in the free gifts of land, labor, and nature, partly because they never really came to a point of state formation. There were conquerors who had control over some land or some territory over some period of time, but this is a period, as I suggested earlier, of almost constant warfare. So, unlike, for example, Beckett, who makes an argument that warfare is the basis for the emergence of cotton as a commodity, I'm suggesting that constant warfare is precisely the reason that prevented the emergence of fish as a particular kind of commodity. State formation, I would argue, strangely also created, led to the creation of fish as a commodity as an unintended consequence. For example, the policies for the uplift and development of poor fishers, which inevitably gets hijacked and captured by those already powerful in that particular play. So, for example, people who are owners of or controllers of the salt trade become fisheries capitalists. Later on in the 1960s, loans that were given out for buying new boat or subsidies for diesel and so on didn't really go to very poor fishers. They were captured by people who had some degree of control and political contacts so that they could capture these kinds of benefits. Perhaps some of you have read Kalyan Sanyal's book called Postcolonial Capitalism, and in that book, if you rely on his argument, as I do to some extent, then one of the arguments that he's making is that the political rights of the poor, even though they're not fully realized, they limit the full development of the commodity and of capital accumulation as well. And as I suggested earlier, it is precisely when the poor become interested in commodity production for their own livelihoods that we begin to see a more developed form of fish and seafood as a commodity. So, in conclusion, I mean, you have colonialism opening frontiers, and it did incorporate regions of India by force into expanded trade circuits from 1496. But these did not become commodity frontiers, and nor did they have the nature exhausting effects that we are told commodity frontiers are supposed to have. I mean, that is, if you've opened up a commodity frontier in 1496, but the exhaustion of the fisheries is happening only in the 1970s, I'm not sure how much explanatory weight you can actually give to the opening of the commodity frontier in terms of creating ecological collapse. A lot is going on in that 500-year period, which can't just be laid on to the opening of a commodity frontier, capitalism, certain kinds of technological changes, and so on. So that is because the logic of commodity production and the universalization of capital does not unfold evenly, both across regions, but also more importantly across resources. So at the same time that other things were becoming much more fully commodity, sugarcane for example, fish was not, and some grain was as well, but fish was not, many other things were not. So not all resources become commodities just because colonialism opens up a new frontier. And so the time lag, the question with which I started, between colonial conquest and the becoming commodity is because of factors beyond colonial rule. The emergence of world markets, the changes in preferences and tastes, the expansion of a general intellect governing the production and consumption of certain things, and the militant opposition of fishers, they basically prevented the full development of the commodity form. So this basically produces a kind of post-colonial difference which is based on a fluid and a global political economy rather than culture and its supposedly universal alterity. Thanks. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry. Your talk gave us a lot to think about, but I just wanted to push back on two things, and I may be completely wrong, but I'd love to hear your opinion on that. First, I'm wondering whether the story that you tell through the story of Prawn about scaling it up to think about post-colonial critique of political economy, I wonder what it would look like from the other side, from the metropolitan side. Because though you associate primitive accumulation with colonialism, I mean, you could also argue, which a lot of Marxists do, that primitive accumulation actually happens within. Colonialism is just one form of it. And in that case, would exactly that same trajectory, the difficulty of some commodities being converted to commodity form, be the same in, say, Britain as it would be in India?
Yes.
So then what is the post-colonial element? And then the second question that I had, which is sort of related, and it goes back to your reading of both Dipesh Chakrabarti and
Kalyan Sanyal,
when you were explaining the difficulty of the commodity form to emerge for prawn, you use, in some ways, one could argue, and I'm not saying you do use it in that way, but I'm saying one could suggest that you offer us a sort of cultural alterity in positing the insistent heterogeneity of the social. I mean, one other way of putting it could have been the insistent revenge of the social, that the social just refuses to be collapsed within the economic. But yet, it seems to me you do push back against Chakrabarti's idea that this is some kind of cultural difference that kind of resists the commodity form. So I wonder how you square that.
Okay. Thanks very much. On your first question, I mean, well, let me take your second question first, in the sense that I basically want to make a political economy argument for difference. Therefore, what I'm also thinking of is that things such as culture do matter within political economy, but the insistence in 2011 that things are still completely separable and maintain an insistent alterity, I think is problematic for a variety of reasons, some of which I've given there. So, for example, you find at the same time that there is the insistent heterogeneity of the social, as I talk about, we have upper class Muslims and Christians who are consuming basically what is seen as the food of Dalit or pariah castes. So right away you can see that there is already a breakdown of culture, and the insistence that some people eat this and other people don't eat that kind of thing, matter of tastes and so on, have become more fluid in that particular scenario. So for me, it is important to think of the post-colonial as something which is in transition, and we can see that in emerging differences in consumption patterns or in tastes and things like that. So something, if for example, if we had taken the view of an insistent alterity to its logical conclusion, then those kinds of hybrid practices of people consuming things that they're not supposed to consume because of caste or religious restrictions against it, that would have somehow held together. So that encounter basically produces new kinds of consuming subjects who are happy to or not happy to, some of them are doing furtively, step out of what are otherwise prescribed by a culture in the way in which is suggested by Dipesh's article on the impossibility of a post-colonial political economy. On your first question, I actually agree with you. I fully agree with you that there are elements of primitive accumulation in the so-called core which are very similar to things which are going on over here as well. I have two things to say to that. So in other words, that again kind of in some ways goes against the idea that things that happen in Europe are provincial to Europe, things that happen elsewhere are very different from that. And it seems to me that if one started off with your premise, which is that of a certain kind of similarity in the logic of the creation of some things as commodity but not as other things as commodity, that is more fruitful in a way. because that would basically suggest that these are not completely different dynamics, that not only is there a similarity between these two dynamics, but a relationship between these two dynamics, right? So that I think is a very good point to make, and in fact, to some extent, I should have made that, because that is exactly the kind of post-colonial political economy I'm thinking of, which does not say things that happen here are different in a complete way. Okay. Yes, please.
I'm not going to use that.
All right. Being recorded.
It's not going to record me. There are two areas where I was a little bit confused, and I think I'm missing the overall structure of
Okay.
the argument. I didn't see what anything before 1947 had to do with your story about prawns. You made it clearly case prawns are different from all these other things. So
Yeah.
just seems like two completely different stories. And the second one, I don't know whether it's related or not. You spoke of you read Marx somewhat differently than I do. That's not what I want to argue about here. But you did talk about the widespread move from use to exchange value. But I didn't see that at all. The prawns weren't used.
Yeah.
And they become used at the same time as they become commodity.
Yeah.
So there's no move from use to exchange value. The commodity has, as Marx says, the double form. And so that's, it's somewhat pinky, but in some sense,
Yeah, I get.
for me, and just the one in the larger context, arguments about primitive accumulation, at least as I understand capital, are one thing, and arguments about the logic of the functioning of capital is something else.
Okay.
And so it's, given that you're talking about the post-colony, I assume we're talking about something within the functioning of capital, the logic of capital. So again, the fact that some of the literature is doing a colonial frontier for primitive accumulation is fine, but again, I don't see the relevance of that to the prawn argument.
Okay, so two things on that. One is that, the Kerala coast is conquered, first by the Portuguese, and then by the Dutch, and then by the British. And it's not just the coast that has been captured. Some bits of the inland, parts of what is now Kerala is also captured. Some of that territory is used, and some of the things that exist in that territory do become, commodities. So there is one argument about the fact that fish doesn't become a commodity, in the sense that we can see from 1787 onwards, yes, there is a producing of it, there's an exporting of it, there's a further refinement of fish into a commodity by the late 1900s and early 20th century, when, for example, you have other elements of the development of the commodity form, its storage, its transportation.
I thought you said in the 16th century they found large.
Yes, but we don't know much about that.
Fish is a commodity in the 16th
Yes.
century.
So yes, but we looked at the 9 or 10 criteria, and my point was that not all of these we can say are fully developed. Beyond the fact that we have two very brief references that salted fish was confiscated, and in one case salted fish was inventoried in a warehouse that was burnt. We have no other thing apart from the fact that salted fish existed. Okay, we don't know how much, we don't know who was buying it, who was selling it. So many other things that we need to know to make a full argument. As I said, beyond that we can't really say much about that. So I also refer to the fact that there's probably a very rudimentary form of the commodity at that point in time, just interpreting these two references that we have in the particular record. Now, prawn, I'm not saying that prawn was never used. I'm only saying that prawn was perhaps used, for example, there is a film in 1961 called Chemin, called Prawns, from Kerala, cult film. It seems to suggest that, people are catching prawn. It seems to suggest that, prawn is a food for some people, but just as in the case of other mollusks and seafood, where the description is they catch a small amount and they seem to be eating it primarily for their own consumption, and maybe some sale through a local bar where people are going for hooch. that is the level at which it seems to have been there. In fact, if you think about my example of there not being recipes for prawn in classic cookbooks, and cookbooks obviously mean that people are reading them, which means they are literate, and perhaps they're being given to women who are getting married and are moving on to their sort of, new home, etc. By and large, it seems that it is a very much a below the radar kind of product. So I would not say that there was extensive evidence about its use, but at the same time there seems to be a lot of suggestions that it was used, but by very poor people. Okay, so you have a kind of a use, kind of economy, which then steps up because the one prawn that flew to the Waldorf Astoria, which basically suddenly, shines a particular, flashlight on this particular commodity that can be, widely used. There was a second question that you had, or is that all that you had?
It was just, you somewhat addressed it.
Okay.
Yes, there was colonialism and the
Yeah.
outside powers were there for hundreds of years, but the fact that
Yeah.
the question is
So the point, why do I even use prawn? Okay, and one reason for that is to sort of get away from the automatic connection that, for example, in my reading Moore makes, or other people make, which is that colonialism opens up a frontier, and he insists quite a lot on defining a frontier very differently. So, for example, if you look at his work on Madeira and the sugar thing, and particularly compare it to Wilmer Dunaway's work, which it seems to me he borrows quite a lot from, but doesn't fully acknowledge. Dunaway does not say that the moment of incorporation of the periphery into an emerging world system necessarily unleashes a logic of capitalism. She says these are zones of incorporation. He actually specifically says that the frontier is not just a zone of incorporation, that a frontier is the opening of commodity production because it is funded by someone, that whole enterprise through which the opening of the frontier has happened. So, for example, on his writings on Madeira, it's a very clear thing. So, one question to ask is, are the bankers who are funding the Portuguese colonization of Madeira bankers in a way in which we would recognize capitalists to be? For example, money lending itself is as old as human civilization, or at least as old as money. So that in itself does not make it capitalist. But what he's saying is that it unleashes a particular logic of capital accumulation, and that is the engine for capitalism to become universal. The commodity, the opening of a commodity frontier is what basically is the vehicle for the for capitalist relations and for capital accumulation, which might have originated elsewhere, but once conquest happens and a frontier is opened up, then that basically makes that logic travel to these new frontiers. So, that is the kind of point I'm trying to make.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. So I guess I have more of an abstract question. I want to just hear you talk more about your theory of a post-colonial political economy. And so you talked a lot about Chakrabarti, and the other person that came to mind as you were speaking was Mitchell's work on the invention of the economy and how he kind of unpacks that. And I kind of feel like there's a latent critique maybe in you of that model, which I want to, just for selfish purposes, want to hear you just kind of expound on.
Well, see, my, to the extent that this is a critique of anyone in particular, it is primarily a critique really of Chibber. Okay. In the sense that, I'm not someone who would make an argument which says that capitalism is not universal. Okay, for something to be going on for X number of centuries and to have its global spread, whether or not it replicates itself in the same kind of way in every part of the world, I don't think it does. But I think that in terms of orienting social relations of production, consumption, wage relationships, and a whole range of other things, and again, like people like Jairus Banerjee, etc., I don't believe that wage relationship is the thing to get fixated on either. So, I mean, my thing is that things don't emerge fully formed as universal, okay? So what you have is a process of universalization. And if you take that into account, which is that things become universal through a process of contestation, negotiation, adaptation, rejection, molding of the original process into forms which are, and you know, we know about caste or other things which get incorporated and are compatible with you know, all kinds of relationships which are capitalist without necessarily losing or dissolving themselves into class and so on. So another example of the insistent heterogeneity of the social. So I'm just thinking, you know, for example, Subir writes against quote unquote identity politics as if class was not one. So one of the things that I wanted to do with all of this was to think of how, and in fact you read the title of an earlier paper of mine from 2016, which is how does capitalism take forms which are very different from those in the original, you know, sites. And I'm particularly motivated in that by reading recent translations such as Kevin Anderson's you know, work on Marx in the Periphery, but also a lot of later writings in which he himself is writing about you know, the heterogeneity of capitalism. So for example, in many of the newly translated writings where he's talking about the fact that, you know, what I'm saying about Eastern Europe is not the same as what I'm talking about in Western Europe and so on. So it's not so much to prove him right per se, because, you know, I'm not that sort of card-carrying Marxist, but it helps us think about how you could think about the world becoming capitalist, as it seems to me it is, while still maintaining the heterogeneity within the world, okay? So, I mean, I'm not also entirely unsympathetic to history 1 and 2 of Dipesh Chakravarti, for that matter, because I think that the idea of heterogeneity is a very important one, and I think it is the question of how much heterogeneity capitalism itself produces rather than flattens, and how much heterogeneity it can incorporate in terms of its reproduction and expansion on a global scale. Okay, so not so much on Mitchell per se, but I think, you know, the idea of the categories of a political economy, such as the one that that Chakravarti seems to be talking about, it doesn't really take us too far. I mean, then you could just, you know, I mean, I didn't say too much about the political ecology side of things, but if you think in terms of many descriptions of environmental movements, okay, they rely almost entirely on culture. Indigenous people love their land, Hindus worship trees, and they perhaps do. But that doesn't mean that they are not a part of a system which is global and which is capitalist. You know, you could still be a worshipper of trees. I mean, we have, for example, our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, who gave a speech barely 10 days ago saying that in Hindu culture we worship trees, while at the same time sanctioning the large-scale cutting down of trees in Bombay, or, you know, the cutting down of trees to come for the making of the you know, rail line for the bullet train, mangroves and so on. So these are in the real world fully compatible with one another. I'm sure timber merchants are very religious and they also worship trees, but that doesn't stop them. And in fact, if I was speaking on the forest side of things, interestingly, you will find that one of the major contractors, or some of the major contractors for timber in the Himalayas, were priests in Badrinath and Kedarnath temples. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.